So everybody, welcome to today's webinar, which is Disabled People's Equality in Fully Inclusive Education. This is part of the Funding Future campaign and a series of webinars being done. Everybody who's going to speak today, there are three of us, are members of the Disabled Members Committee. That's elected every year at the Disabled Members Conference, and I'll refer to it as the DMSC when I mention it. I would encourage any disabled member who wants to help to organise and change what's happening about our inclusion in education to sign up and to come to the conference and stand for the committee. Today we're going to try and think about what's happening to disabled people and carers, begin to address some of what we need for an inclusive future, and hopefully do a bit of thinking about what education might look like in an inclusive future. We've had about 70 questions, which I think is amazing. It shows the engagement of our members now in disabled people's equality in education. It gives us an idea of the scale of the exclusion that our members and our students are facing within education, and some pointers to what we need to do. Unfortunately, we can only answer a couple of questions today, although where we can, we're referring to things that have been asked in our little introductory speeches, but we are going to respond to all the questions that have been asked. And we'll put those answers on the website and also in the activist network that we've developed recently, and in the DMSC we will try to think about future webinars where we could all begin to answer some of these questions together, because how we organise is something for all of us. So I'm Elaine Heffernan and I'm the chair of DMSC at the moment. I'm on the National Executive Committee representing disabled members in FE, and I had to give up my full-time job because of impairment, and I'm now doing some quite marginal tutoring really in my subject. We have Thamisa Neckles, who is the vice chair of the DMC and who works at Sheffield University. She's going to speak about reasonable adjustments, hidden disability, and so on. And we have Lucy Burke from Manchester Met, who's an HE rep in the NEC for disabled members, and she's done some amazing work in helping us to create in the union an access checklist, which will soon be available to all of you. So I'm going to try and start us off, and then Thamisa, and then Lucy, and questions. It's a hard time to be talking about disabled people's equality. We learned last month from the Office of National Statistics that 2/3 of everyone who died so far in the corona crisis has been a disabled person. That as a disabled woman, I am 11 times more likely to die than a non-disabled woman, and a disabled man is 6.5 times more likely to die than a non-disabled man. That euphemism, underlying health condition, that meant us. And research shows that 63% of all disabled people have really lived in terror during the corona times, of thinking that we will not get medical treatment because of the do not attempt to resuscitate notices that have gone out, because of the ethics, pandemic ethics that they are called, and because people were fearing, rightly, when the hospitals were full, being left or taken off ventilators and just left to die. We've watched in horror as the government has dismantled in a few months the legal rights that it took us years of campaigning and fighting and protesting and resisting to win. To independent living, to integrated education, and even the basic right to be consulted before a DNAR notice is posted on us. There are no fewer than 17 breaches of the law regarding our rights and equality and human rights. We're exhausted from campaigning to get them back. We know that disabled people can only really be understood as a category if we are talking about an intersectional group of people. I want to make that really clear at the beginning. There is something about being a disabled person that exists only as an intersectional category in very many ways. When I talk about the statistics of disabled people who died, we know that Black people have been much more likely to die than white people because of the toxic, really, combination of structural racism and what that does with health inequalities, and of course the shoving of Black people without PPE into the front line of work. So we know that our struggle is an intersectional struggle, but not only in terms of structural racism, but also in terms of every other category of discrimination and oppression within society. To live in trauma, to live with oppression and discrimination, creates both trauma responses, mental distress, and ill health, actually physical ill health in people in the here and now, but also has an epigenetic effect down the generations, which creates greater disability in all the categories of of people who face discrimination and oppression. I know that as an Irish person from the effects of the famine on Irish people's health even today. So as far as I'm concerned, we will never have an inclusive education if we only talk about disabled access needs, unless we have anti-racist education, unless we decolonise the curriculum from nursery to PhD level, unless we stamp out sexual harassment, unless we stamp out queer and transphobia, then education will be a place creating mental distress and disabled people rather than being a part of the solution. So to talk about disabled needs, I think we have to fight for it everywhere, including inside of the union. I want to be clear, inside of trade unions, we still face struggles around discrimination. We face struggles around lack of the things that we need for access. Those of us with conditions that create brain fog or hidden disabilities like dyspraxia often face prejudicial ideas. I know that personally, but that's true of all our impairment across the categories. It isn't just a targeted attack on discrimination that we face that makes education unequal. You know, the lack of reasonable adjustments, the lack of accessible buildings, the comments, the way that people are pushed to show themselves to be better workers, produce more, get over their impairments by, you know, miraculous efforts of will inside the workplace. That isn't the only thing that we face, that discrimination. We are now facing also redundancies, the push by senior management to blend learning without resources, a greater double burden really on largely women to provide the care for relatives that is being cut and still to go to work, the return to campus without clear masks, and redundancies when we know that you are currently, research showed it last week actually, if you are a disabled person, you are twice as likely to be made redundant when redundancies are coming than a non-disabled person is. So there is a huge amount of different discrimination going on. And against all of this, without any budget that has been allocated for anything but tokenism, we are going to try and imagine a world in which there is investment in education, in which there is access to education, in which future equality is funded. Big, tough ask. We're not going to do all of that in the next hour. But I want to just point to the key things so we can begin to think together in the union about how we move forward, how we work together to change what happens in a time of austerity and cuts that are going to come around Corona. So I think inclusion requires three things. It requires that the government and that our vice chancellors, our principals, our senior management team make a political choice to fund us. It means putting the argument about the many benefits, economic and social, of inclusion of everyone in education, because there are many benefits, of course, for our inclusion in society. We're not a burden or any of those things that the Tories have said. It means an end to austerity. It means that the attack that led the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty, not even poverty, extreme poverty, and human rights to criticise the UK government that has driven us back in terms of our living standards and ability to engage, that has to be ended. And money, people will say there is no money, we can't get money. You know, this is a crisis, we've had to fund Corona, blah, blah, blah. It was the banks 10 years ago, it's Corona today. There is money. If the PCS union has showed that if all of the wealthy were to pay all of their taxes, there would be no austerity. And if we added a little more of a wealth tax, we can easily afford a basic income for all disabled people and all of the costs of inclusion. Last little bit, we need two other things. We need to scrap austerity. That's my second point. My third point is that disabled people have to be at the heart of the redesign of education from nursery, but particularly as we're interested in the post-16 sector. In the movement, we call this co-production, as opposed to the token engagement of the 2 ticks and all of those things that have gone on. We have the slogan, nothing about us without us, for a reason. It means that we want to be included in actually designing how buildings will look, how services will run, what adjustments take place, what new technology our amazing colleagues in the university labs can dream up for us. And that has to be intersectional. It has to be not just the old white men who are often those consulted, but it has to be planning nothing without the organisations like ALFI and People First in terms of learning disabilities, without the caring organisations and DPOs. I've talked too long, so I'm going to stop. And I want to introduce the MISA to speak next, and then Lucy, and then we will come to questions.
Thank you, Elaine, and good afternoon all. I will talk briefly about a future where accessing reasonable adjustments is not a barrier. Let's just remind ourselves that a reasonable adjustment is a change to remove or reduce the effect of our disability so we can do our jobs. And a barrier is anything presenting a challenge that might prevent us from advancing our careers or from getting or keeping our jobs. While our ableist institutions tend to perceive us to be less valuable and inferior to our non-disabled colleagues and define us by our disabilities, the Equality Act 2010 places a duty upon employers to make adjustments that aim to remove physical barriers and or provide extra support in a number of other ways where reasonable, so that disabled workers are not put at a disadvantage when compared to their non-disabled colleagues. We can therefore ask line managers to make the necessary changes. And if they don't, we can make a discrimination claim under the Equality Act. UCU continues to forge alliances with disabled people's organizations and continue to develop guidance on establishing and maintaining diverse, inclusive working environments for people with disabilities. But the bottom line is that the union needs our support to ensure accessing reasonable adjustments is no longer a barrier. A future where accessing reasonable adjustments is not a barrier means first and foremost developing the confidence to disclose our disability or range of disabilities to our employers, particularly those of us with hidden disabilities or disabilities which may be considered unique. The Equality Act states that once a disability is disclosed to an employer, the employer has a duty to make reasonable adjustments at work for the employee, and this is embedded in the Act to protect those who choose to disclose. Despite this legislation, we understand that disclosing a disability to an employer is a very personal decision with potentially far-reaching consequences for the employee, and there is no obligation on anybody to do so. We also understand that this might be even more problematic for disabled workers on casualized contracts because there is a fear of losing their jobs. During these unprecedented times, the pandemic has created further anxieties around disclosure. Some of us diagnosed with autoimmune conditions or severe migraine, for example, might not have previously disclosed this to our employers and now feel stuck. Those of us with visual impairments like myself might be experiencing severe mental fatigue due to the relentless on-screen working, and some of us cannot ask for help. Now that we are being asked to consider returning to campus, some of us are faced with the fear of commuting long distances on public transport. And as Elaine alluded to, the pandemic could be disproportionately affecting people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. And therefore, returning to campus is causing heightened levels of anxiety and mental anguish, not only for BAME disabled workers, but for all disabled workers with further underlying health conditions. You can see from these examples how perhaps not previously disclosing a disability might put some of us in a difficult position right now. So a future where accessing reasonable adjustments is not a barrier means having greater levels of openness to disclose our disabilities as soon as we can without fear of discrimination. This should be a number one priority in increasing equality and improving working conditions for all. It is our right by law to be open about our disabilities and to have the appropriate adjustments made to help us do our job. It also means enforcing existing policies and developing further policy guidelines around accessing reasonable adjustments to protect us from discrimination. It also means implementing the mandatory use of the reasonable adjustment passport in the workplace and making use of occupational health in providing us with supporting evidence for the adjustments we feel we might need. Finally, it means understanding that creating a truly diverse and welcoming workplace goes beyond doing research and gathering data, and it must be a part of the full employee life cycle. UCU continues to work towards raising awareness about reasonable adjustments and providing resources and support in order to give workers the confidence they need to disclose their disability. This means a future with perhaps less casework and more collective actioning through peer-to-peer support to overcome our fears of disclosing. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. And we're going to go to, thank you, Thamisa. Sorry, we're going to go to Lucy next. That's what happens when you have impaired people chairing.
Thanks so much. My name is Lucy Burke. I represent disabled members on the NEC. I work at Manchester Met, and I live with a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which means I have severe osteoarthritis. And I'm also the mum of 2 children, one of whom, my son, has autism and a learning disability and quite significant additional needs. I think it's important to remember that people with impairments can also be carers, and to underscore what Elaine says about an intersectional approach. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities, both inside and outside our workplaces. Over the last few months, a lot of us have been doing 2 jobs: the invisible and undervalued labour of caring and educating children at home, and huge increases in workload that's involved in teaching, producing new online materials, learning how to access new and use new online platforms, and in higher education as well, in trying to maintain some kind of research activity. I think my situation has been made more difficult in that there's been a kind of collapse in the care networks that my son would usually access. And this is tied up with the government's failure to plan for or anticipate the needs of disabled people during this pandemic situation. There's been no strategic thinking about this and no work with disabled people's organisations really to speak of. And I think also I felt very anxious. Elaine mentioned the blanket imposition of do not resuscitate orders. And this has a specific bearing on the lives of learning disabled people who already, prior to the pandemic, face massive health inequalities, huge differentials in life expectancy, and a very toxic attitude towards the value of their lives. And as someone who loves somebody with a learning disability, this makes it all particularly anxiety provoking. So we know that in this country, working age carers face a higher rate of poverty than people without caring responsibilities, and that women of working age who are carers are at greatest risk of all. We also know that with an ageing population, more and more of us are going to be involved in supporting older people with conditions like dementia or who have sort of more generalised support needs. The impact of caring in our current system is not just about additional costs or financial detriment. It's also about time poverty and about the barriers that this causes. In my experience, higher education particularly is built around the kind of model of the endlessly productive academic without a body and without dependence. And I think this, this poses particular kinds of difficulties if you are a disabled person or a carer for a disabled dependent. So the kind of metric output-driven environment that we work in is really difficult if you can't take 2 weeks away to finish a monograph or the time to go to conferences and build those networks. So the opportunity to flourish in our workplace is really diminished. And it's unsurprising that so many people find it difficult to stay in work. I think it's very notable that HESA, the Higher Education Statistics Agency, collects data on students who are carers, but doesn't collect data on employees or staff or academics in our workplaces who have caring responsibilities. And this absence is mirrored in workplaces which often fail to collect or acknowledge carers too. I think it's coupled with a difficulty as well, which is about when people do disclose as carers, they tend to find and be sort of pushed to sort of find individual responses to the situation that they're in. But I think that what we need as a union, and what we need as a group of workers, is a collective response to the burden of caring. Sorry, I shouldn't say not the burden of caring, but the work of caring and its impact on workers. And I think we need to value care and value what people who do care can bring to our workplaces. We need to recognise this too as a trade union movement. I think we have to work hard to remove barriers to participation that carers experience, and we have to reorient our understanding of activism to include people with caring responsibilities. I think it would be fantastic if we could build a campaign to support and connect carers in the union, and to work together to imagine what a workplace built around caring and carers would look like, and to end the time poverty that causes so many of us such a sort of negative sort of impact on our lives and health and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. So we're going to move to some questions, and massive apologies for the ones that we cannot get to. So just before we move to that, can I just draw all of your attention to the Disabled Activist Network that we've just set up has produced some requests that relate to what Lucy and Vanessa have been saying as part of our asks for return after Coroner. First question is an interesting question. It's about whether or not we are going to ask our employers to sign up to and use the Sunflower lanyard scheme. And I'm going to answer that one, actually. So yeah, are we going to actively encourage educators to participate? I think it's a really interesting question. And it's a dilemma, really. Wherever access isn't built into institutions as a matter of course, which is where we begin, it should be. We want it, and we're going to fight for that. But while it isn't, do we out ourselves by wearing a lanyard? Some issues it's the same issue, really, that we all face around the question of do we disclose? Because of the level of discrimination, many people will pass if they can possibly pass, and have all sorts of amazing strategies, some of which create a lot of anxiety, actually, for getting through education as someone who is neurodivergent. We have all sorts of ways of trying to pass, and all sorts of ways of hiding because of what happens in terms of discrimination. And it is great, half of us are unemployed. So wearing a lanyard can identify you as the worker to be specially checked that you meet your targets. Can you perform properly? Do you have too much sick? It can lead to disability hate crime. We know that from public transport. We know it from shops at the start of the pandemic. If doctors hadn't known the names of people with Down syndrome, they couldn't possibly have imposed those DNAR notices on them. I guess my answer is that I think we should campaign for a disabled persons inclusion policy in every institution, and maybe begin to think about a charter, actually demand a charter for institutions to sign up to, like Athena Swan, because that creates a bit of a tick box, but it also creates pressure that we can push to make real change. And as part of that, we could argue that lanyards are available for everybody who chooses to have them as a matter of course, that everyone can sign up, take one if they want to. But using that thing has some dangers, really. It could be just a tick box exercise again. It can't work unless everybody in the institution is educated in inclusion for disabled people. There have to be robust and fully implemented policy and procedure to deal with discrimination, and possibly a proper restorative justice process for where it takes place. The danger of lanyards without that is it can be the black triangle on our arm for everyone who wishes to discriminate and attack, really. So last bit, my big but, we absolutely should not have to need a scheme like that, because we need to have an access to education that is designed from the physicality of the buildings to the technology that we use, to who is allowed on courses and whether you have to pass exams all the time, to all the other policies that exist that are inclusive to begin with, and where everybody understands that there are individual needs of humans to engage in processes, and where we can, they are met institutionally, and where not, individuals can simply ask for them. So I'd like to replace it in the end by inclusion. Okay, that was me whittling on. The next question is going to Thamisa, and I have managed to lose, where it is, that's it, sorry. So Thamisa, could you answer, how can we ensure that there is a coordinated approach to support?
I think a lot, I'm hoping this question relates to the ways in which we can support particularly people with disabilities that are hidden. But I would speak to all sorts of disabilities. And I think first and foremost, a coordinated approach means understanding what your needs are and getting in touch with your branch for advice, particularly if you have disclosed. And of course, if you haven't made that disclosure to your employer, it would be really beneficial to do so, because that would be part of the ways in which you could be provided with support. So getting in touch with your branch for advice, having colleagues and getting involved in peer-to-peer support, where colleagues encourage you to disclose, encourage you to share your experiences. And I found I have learned quite a lot about the things that I could have had support with due to my own disability. I have visual vertigo. So colleagues, by me sharing my experiences of what it's like to be a person with a hidden disability, were able to share with me access to work. They were able to share with me the different types of software that I might be able to try to, to enable me to do my work more effectively. So when we talk about coordinated approach, it is wide and varied, but it is also more collective. So I talked about having this collective organization where we draw on each other, we draw on the branch. We also would like you to, I think, as a coordinated approach, to use the adjustment passport as a way of documenting agreed adjustments. Because specifically, if I'm talking about reasonable adjustments, that adjustment passport is a live record of agreed adjustments between you and your manager to support you at work due to a health condition, an impairment, or disability. So that is another way to include, your needs within a space for supportive approach, a supported and coordinated approach. Then there's also being referred to occupational health. What I find about occupational health as a way of supporting reasonable adjustments in particular is that you can have an appointment which is geared to discussing the needs that you have, and occupational health will help manage that with your manager, and you'd have those discussions with occupational health. Those discussions are taken to your line manager, and then you have a coordinated approach to support so that you can have the needs met. So I think basically that's what I would say in terms of having a coordinated approach to support. Thank you.
Rebecca, sorry, could you remove, if you're able to, could you remove the sign with your name on, because it's some people can't see your signing. I don't know if you can do it. Okay, if somebody could try and remove that, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Thamisa, you may have answered the next question, actually, that I was going to ask you already, but I don't know if there's anything that you want to add on how we can better support unseen and overlooked impairments such as migraine.
Yes, thank you. So, and I think that's one of the questions that I talked through when I was giving the talk. I think all the questions around hidden disabilities and support were very similar. So the things that I would have said in terms of a coordinated approach will also be reasonable for supporting unseen and often overlooked disabilities. As I said, I would use myself as an example. As a person with visual vertigo, it is difficult for anyone to know that I have a disability. And one of the things that I found very helpful for me in terms of getting support was talking to people and sharing my experiences, telling them what it is like to live with a hidden disability, and sensitizing people in understanding what that means. Because if an individual or a group of people or your line manager does not understand and doesn't know, then it would be difficult to have support. If your line manager and colleagues are not aware of the multiple types of conditions that or impairments that we have as disabled people, then they won't be able to respond appropriately to our needs. So I would go back to what I said earlier about disclosing. It is really important to disclose. And I understand that you may, you lay yourself bare and you become more vulnerable. But if we want an inclusive space and we want to be recognized as being able to do our job with additional reasonable adjustments, then it means saying something. Thanks, Elaine.
Yes, and helping us to organise together to win things. Okay, so Lucy, I've got some questions for you now. So how do we ensure that disabled learners are not excluded or marginalised? A huge question for 3 minutes.
I'll do my best. I think that you need a kind of system that responds from the earliest age onwards, really, to begin to address and challenge exclusion. I mean, in some ways, inclusion is a problem word because it's based on the assumption of exclusion of people. But for lots of disabled people and disabled young people, there's a system of segregation at an educational level that removes them, for instance, via special schools, from their communities, from other children, other non-disabled children. And it's not surprising then that you get a kind of embedding of exclusion, of isolation, of not being part of a community, of not being visible in a community, because young people are often bussed outside of those communities, don't have the opportunity to build the relationships and the social experiences that you need. And often that has a detrimental impact on confidence and on aspiration as well, on the kind of understanding of what you might do or what your value is as a person. I think we also have to reorient ideas around value and some of the ideas of kind of intellectual or academic achievement as intrinsically valuable things about people, because I think there's a lot of other things about people that education ought to value and ought to bring out and recognize. So I think we've got to think in a much more sort of systemic sense about it. I think we've got to have systems that begin with accessibility, not tag it on at the end. Accessibility needs to be the first thing that we think about, not the last thing we think about. As we ought to have a culture which embeds various aspects of accessibility in terms of the language we use, the fonts we use, the materials we produce, because I fundamentally believe that kind of system, that's something that starts with the needs of a diverse range of people and seeks to meet them, is good for everybody. And I was just thinking about Tamisa's answer as well, and I think the other thing that we need to think about as a resource for people with additional needs is time. So people, we work to sort of impossible and unsustainable deadlines often, unsustainable numbers of hours. People are asked to do things in time periods which are very difficult for them. I think we need to think about addressing the time we have to do all of the activities we need to, and I think that's important in terms of an accessible education system as well. That's me.
for you. We've been discussing this a lot in the Disabled Activist Network, tea break calls that you can all join on Tuesdays at 3 o'clock. What are some of the biggest recurrent online accessibility challenges? There are many. Give us what you can.
Okay, so I think a lot of the platforms that people have used and implemented in workplaces were implemented and decided upon without any reference whatsoever to whether or not they're accessible. So that is a first major obstacle, and it relates back to what I was saying about when and how people think about accessibility. So it should be the first thing that people think about. It should be preemptive and anticipatory, but instead it is usually the last thing that people think about, leaving people with impairments to find complicated workarounds if they can, and that's not acceptable as far as I'm concerned. I think there are issues around things like captioning, how information is delivered, around training and the time it takes to learn these systems, around working out how to make them as accessible as they can be. There are issues about the sort of sensory overload people experience. If you have multiple faces, for instance, on a screen at the same time, that can be hard. I think there's also issues around the fatigue that they can cause as well. I think there's an assumption that if you're working from home on an online platform, you can sit in Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting. There are other platforms available, but endless numbers of meetings, one after the other, without a break. And in fact, this is really bad for people as well, I think, and very difficult, and particularly difficult if you have a sort of musculoskeletal impairment, if sitting still for a long time causes you pain, if you have sensory processing issues, so I think in lots of ways these can be liberating and be ways of enabling disabled people to work from home more effectively, things that employers have often said isn't possible. But I think that we what we really have to do is to pay attention to the ways in which they meet a kind of diverse range of additional needs, and unfortunately I don't think that's been done in a lot of cases.
See, and really everyone, apologies for the issues with obscuring Rebecca's work, and thank you for doing this, Rebecca, for us. Okay, I've got one question to me. What will it take to make large educational institutions become proactive about disability rather than hiding behind legal requirements, etc., set by somebody else, e.g. the architect who set the place? I really like this question because I think it relates to a number of questions about this topic on charter marks and various things, and how will we make our management take notice. There's a lot to say, and I think maybe we should have a webinar on this together to map it out, really, because it speaks to the need to map out what we want changed, what we want to be included that usually is beyond the imagination of our employers and so on, and also on how we build the power to get them to do it. Currently, I think far too much of our approach has to rely on the law, such as the Equality Act, the Human Rights Act, the Health and Safety Act. And one of the things that's been going on in discussions within union branches and within the union is that we could meet the needs of disabled members through just health and safety stuff, through the health and safety officers. I don't think that's right. I think that this is a systemic problem of oppression and discrimination that is economic and social, and it isn't simply about giving us some equipment for our work, etc. And I think we have to win that argument within the union in order to mobilize sufficiently organisation to show power to our management to change things. So we need to have to be able to move away from only protecting our rights legally, which has been very important, very important. It's how some of the turning back of the 17 breaches of law have been pushed back by disabled people organising in the middle of a pandemic in March and April and so on. So that's important, but our whole approach cannot rely on that, or even on charter marks. It has to rely on a social model, a reimagined, reinvigorated social model of disability. And the only way we're going to get that is collective action. Thamisa has referred to it, Lucy's referred to it. We have to get power inside of our workplaces so that we can, one, encourage more of our members to dare to disclose. I know lots of people in the union at all sorts of levels who never talk about their impairments or their mental distress because that's just still seen as quite shameful and so on. So we need to create an atmosphere like the Black Rights Matter movement has created that makes people, obviously Black people can't hide like we can, but it makes such a difference, doesn't it? You know, from the 1960s, we are beautiful. Our hair, you know, how we look as Black people is beautiful, creates pride in people. We need to create that for ourselves inside of the disabled people's movement, really, and move away from an individual model as much as we can. So I would say what it will take is organisation and power. The putting of a statue by people peacefully into a harbour has taken down statues all over the country. Power is what we need. Get away from the medical model, have the social model, and fight together. That's my answer. We also need a charter demands. We need an Athena Swan and all of those things as well. So that is us on questions. We've got just under 20 minutes left. I can see some comments are coming up, including that it is really important that we address these things. And it is really good that the union is organised to address these things. And before we all make some closing remarks, I would like to say that that comes about because of disabled members becoming visible and organising. The motion a couple of years ago to have a day of action, the day of action around disabled inclusion, has been amazing. The first big meeting we held in Parliament, the way in which branches have begun to organise. My favourite, I have to say, were Cambridge and Liverpool on the first day of action. Sorry to anyone I missed, didn't see your pictures. But in Liverpool, they took tape and disabled members put that do not cross police tape across every entrance of their campus. And there were many, including to the union office, that were not accessible buildings for everybody to access. That protest made a difference in terms of their management beginning to talk about these issues. It doesn't get one in a day, but taking part, whatever level. Thamisa organised in her with somebody else organised an amazing briefing for members' rights on that day. Some people only managed to do a stall or to, give us something like that, something smaller. But whatever you can do to begin to make it visible that there is a fight against discrimination, do it, do it, do it, do it. So some remarks to close. If it's okay to go in reverse order, I don't know if you're ready to take Lucy and then myself. No, sorry, then Thamisa and then myself, if that's okay. Are you ready, Luce?
Yeah, I think I'm ready. Thank you. I've been thinking a lot about all of these things, and some of the other work that I do is with the Green New Deal, and thinking about what a future that's built around addressing climate emergency might be like as well. And I think one of the things you might say about care is it's one of the greenest kinds of activities that we can engage in, and it is important, I think, that we place it at the forefront of the ways in which we might reimagine a more just and equal future. I would love to see and to build a society or a world in which care is reconnected with love and care for each other as a very positive value, as opposed to now the way it's construed often negatively in terms of impact and burden and detriment, all of which it has very kind of brutal effects on people's lives. I would like to be able to reimagine care that way, and to also reimagine disability not as deficit but as a difference that helps reimagine the world as well, in meaningful and productive ways itself. I think that in terms of what we can do, I think we need to place the needs of carers at the forefront of our thinking. I think it's not viewed as a protected characteristic, but I think it's an important element in understanding the obstacles people might face at work, and I think we need to think very carefully about this in relationship to time and to workloads and to the organisation of work. So I would like us to be able to build an education system and to build a future in which we were enabled to care and do the work of caring alongside our work, without the kinds of detriments and difficulties and obstacles to flourishing at work that we currently face. Thanks.
Lucy, that was really quick. I am wondering, Vanessa, if you'd like to come in and give us 5 minutes of closing remarks.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Elaine. So I would like us to think of a future where accessing reasonable adjustments is not a barrier. I want us to think about this as depending on all of us. So I want to emphasize the importance of collective action through sharing our stories, as long as we feel able to do so and we feel that it's safe. I want us to encourage and support members to disclose their disabilities and non-members to join our union and to disclose their disabilities. This pandemic has shown us how important it is that people know and understand what we are faced with, what our daily lives are like. And if we don't do that, then we cannot access help. I want us to raise awareness about reasonable adjustments through branch campaigns and the use of the reasonable adjustment passport, because I feel that is very important to having or experiencing reasonable adjustments where there are no barriers. I want us to share UCU resources that are available to us to support workers and our other colleagues through disclosing as well as after they disclose, because UCU has some brilliant resources that can be made available to us and should be made available through collective action. I think it is important to identify and or create networks and working groups that focus on developing proposals for actioning reasonable adjustments as appropriate. If accessing reasonable adjustments is not on our agenda, then neither, frankly, should equality, diversity, and inclusion be part of that agenda. Finally, I want us to remember something really important. If a disabled person does not disclose their disability, they cannot claim reasonable adjustments if they are going through a capability process. And I understand, like I said in my talk earlier, it is really difficult for some of us to disclose. But I would like people to think about this and reflect on this carefully, given our unprecedented times. And, especially this is something that we want to reflect on and think on really strongly. If someone has a long-term health condition that he or she has not disclosed, employers will always point out that reasonable adjustments could not be made as they were not aware of the situation. And finally, the Equality Act 2010 places a duty upon employers to make adjustments that aim to remove these barriers wherever reasonable. So we are not put at a disadvantage when compared to non-disabled person. So that's my final takeaway. I want us to remember that, because we have got an act which we are able to use in our commitment to accessing reasonable adjustments. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. We've got actually a couple of extra minutes, which is extremely rare, especially when I'm involved, as I often talk far too much. But I'm going to we had so many questions. I just want to acknowledge the ones that have come from our colleagues on the front line in prisons, attempting to educate people who have all kinds of structural horrors in their life that often mean, that inside of prisons are very many. The figures for disabled women in prisons actually is really quite shocking how disproportionate it is. We know what happens in terms of the justice system, in terms of young Black people and so on. Many of those prisoners are there highly traumatized, having had highly difficult circumstances, and our members are in there trying to help them, trying to educate, trying to help people to see a different kind of future. There is a whole webinar on prisons. I think it's on Tuesday, so have a look for that. But I'm just going to try and tackle one of the questions, which is, do new prisons currently in development allow for full disabled access for prisoners and staff? My guess, because I don't know enough, so hopefully this question will come up again on Tuesday, is that there will be a better standard of physical access than the 19th century horrors that they constantly claim cannot be made accessible for disabled people because of the structure of the buildings. I don't think that's true, actually. In Cambridge, St John's College is the only one that has managed, I think, to get full accessibility into an old building. So it is possible. It's a question of funding and political will. We believe that it will be better because there will be new builds. But here's the problem. The Ministry of Justice has set out the government's priorities with the new prisons, and they're not to rehabilitate, to untraumatize, to make people see themselves as part of society. They are designed with enhanced security in mind, barless windows to stop waste being thrown out and prevent prisoners accessing drugs and mobile phones flown in by drones, network cabling to enable modern security measures, such as scanning, etc., to prevent smuggling of illicit items. So it doesn't look like accessibility is very high up on their agenda. We know, although there is all kinds of human rights for individual prisoners and staff, of course, in terms of the right to reasonable adjustments, the human rights that people hold, as well as the Equality Act rights. But as it happens, we have had member after member who works in prison who has either a physical or sensory impairment, who has found themselves without even the most basic of reasonable adjustments. And some of this is a question of union power and union organisation. As our prisons work has been getting stronger and stronger in terms of the branches organising themselves, then actually the employers have been more likely to put in adjustments. So I think that's our theme, really: organise and push for power. Okay, I want to finish. I guess my closing remarks will be saying, imagine going into a campus, an area of education, that every single entrance point is built for wheelchair users to wheel in, that has the appropriate level of lighting, that has access for people with sensory impairments, that perhaps you can pick up at the door those things everyone wears in the tape, with their little headphones guiding them around the building, that you, from the moment you enter it, know you are part of that institution. Imagine where light switches and power sockets are not up there high at a level for only one kind of physical body, but that voices could be used to, because we have all that technology to activate the light switches, the power sockets, that there's technology for people with dysphonia to use who can't use their voice in those things, that there's the backup ones at both levels, for people in chairs, for people who are of short stature, and for people who are taller to be able to use. Imagine having the right signage for everyone to get around. Imagine having access programs on every computer so that you don't even have to tire out your hands when you don't have an impairment or risk developing RSI by being able to use your voice. Imagine that we return in September where we are able and wish to. It's one of the key demands of the Disabled Activist Network that in terms of blended stuff, only those who feel able and safe to be on campus are there, and that it continues from home for those who do not. And we want that social model. But imagine for those who are going in, that there at the management have provided you with really good, clear masks so that lip readers can communicate as a matter of course and without special adjustment. Imagine a Rebecca hanging around in the canteen so that people who want to chat from the deaf community to other non-deaf people are able to do so. That's a whole different world. And if we want to get there, and if we want to go into classrooms where we are taught about William Cuffey, the disabled Black chartist, where we learn the history of the earliest organization from disabled people for their rights, if we want to understand the different ways in which impairment has been seen and valued, devalued or valued in different cultures, in which acceptability has existed in the ancient hunter-gathering communities often, then we need to decolonize the curriculum in terms of racism, but we also need to make it inclusive in terms of all the other oppressions, invisibilities, and removing a side of people that exist, I think. So that's what we want. And to get there, we are going to need to have power and organization. We have a vast amount of work to do, and we need all of our disabled members to become involved in doing that work. Actually, with Lucy's, our staff are not enormous. We don't have enough of them to do everything that we all want to happen, even that range of questions that have come in. But between us, we have talents and skills and ability to organize. So, Lucy and her colleagues have very kindly helped to create this new accessibility tool that's going up. The disabled members' passport has come out of ideas from activists in another union and within our union to create that. You have a real chance to help us to organize both for what we need, to consult us, to be part of that solution, but also to create, if you're not disabled, and if you are disabled, together, the unity and power to make our employers and our government see that different future. It can only be done with struggle. I believe it can only be done with organization. Everything that we got in terms of the Equality Act, which was the disabled, the DPA before, everything that we got in the past has come out of people organizing. I'm old now, I'm nearly 60. So I remember seeing, before I had my accident and inquired, a whole range of impairments that have come as a gift of that accident. I remember seeing people chaining themselves to buses in Oxford Street. That was an incredibly brave thing to do in the 1980s, really. Incredibly brave thing to do. Those organizations made the difference for us. And we need to get organized inside our workplaces at every level, from providing information, from helping our members to understand their right to reasonable adjustment, to being the little voice that includes and makes people feel part of it. The little changes we can make, but also for the bigger ones. So please organize for the next day of action. There's going to be so much on your plates, but understand that disabled people are twice as likely to be made redundant as a non-disabled person in these coming months. Disabled members are very high in our early years researchers, or in the marginalized sections of teachers within both university and further education, because of the way that impairment and caring responsibilities are meshed together, and the economic exclusion that goes along with it. So please get organized. Please join the Disabled Activists Network. You can just email in order to do that. And please come to the Disabled Members Conference if you are a disabled member. I think that's on the 5th of, oh no, I'm losing my date, sorry. I think that's the beginning of December. Our day of action will be taking place, I don't know if you can put it up again, Sharon, at the end of November. And also there is a chance to get involved in this weekly meeting of the activists. Anybody who wants to can be part of that network. And I would love to hear from you. We'd love to get you involved. Enough of me going on. We've used up our time. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the staff, and to Lucy and Thamisa and to Rebecca. And again, massive apologies that we put the name tag in the way of her hands. I'm very sorry for that disruption to our members. Thank you.
Thank you.